I doubt Richie G back in the day was like, someday these color pips,
right.
they're going to be counted.
Distraction makers.
All right, let's talk about devotion.
Oh, that's what we're talking about.
Right.
Right.
Devotion has a very interesting history. We also think it's a very good mechanic. And I kind of can't believe that it's not evergreen.
Yep.
But yeah, let's get into it.
Devotion started initially in the set Eventide. Eventide?
Eventide, yeah.
All right.
It's part of the Lorwyn block. Lorwyn actually was two set blocks, sort of, where you had Lorwyn, Morningtide, Shadowmoor, Eventide.
Okay, gotcha.
And Lorwyn, Morningtide was happy, everything's lovely. Shadowmoor and Eventide was everything's bad.
Okay.
Everything's evil.
And that's when they put
scary.
Chroma in?
You know, Chroma didn't make a lot of sense.
All right, so for those that don't know, Chroma is, it's not a keyword, it's an ability word. We found out there's apparently a difference there. And a keyword is something that you could reference and is usually expandable, where an ability word is sort of like that italics.
It's almost like
mark.
It's almost like flavor text for an ability.
Right, and it's sort of letting you know, like, ahead of time, like, hey, this block of text you're about to read has something to do with
other
like color pips or
right, in Chroma's case.
In Chroma's
specifically.
Case.
Yeah. So we didn't even talk about the first card that inspired Chroma. We can go back even a step further to Future Sight.
Oh, right.
Where there's this card called Phosphorescent Feast, which is a mouthful.
Yes.
Where basically Aaron Forsyth created this card, and he basically created a card that was... It said if you reveal a certain number of green cards or whatever from your hand, you gain 2 life for each color pip.
Right.
And that was the initial thought for Chroma, which then eventually leads to Devotion. But we'll finish up Chroma and then.
Right. And apparently in Chroma, apparently in Eventide, Chroma was just kind of like seen as kind of whatever. It wasn't like a super impressive ability. People weren't really like blown away by it. It also was only printed on 10 cards, so it's like not real, and none of the cards were like super exciting.
Yeah, this might be a consequence of it being a smaller set.
Like it didn't have enough to go off.
Yeah,
of.
just not enough. I wanted to get a certain number of keywords into the set, so you're kind of like, well, we get 10 or something, 10 cards that get to have the keyword.
The other thing, apparently, this was something that Mark Rosewater brought up in his Drive to Work podcast when he's talking about Theros, I think, is that when he was initially designing Chroma for Eventide, he put Chroma in because it was a hybrid mana theme. So it was hybrid mana, which started, I think, in Ravnica, and then eventually they kind of kept it going into Eventide. I think his heart was in the right place, where he's like, okay, you could pick either, like green or red or whatever mana,
right.
And so if you end up having a Chroma for green or red, that hybrid mana pip counts as one either.
Or yeah. So if you had like a hybrid mana green red card and green white card, if you had Chroma for green, both of those cards would work.
Yeah.
So the idea, I think, was you would have more color pips rather than some color pips and some colorless pips.
Right.
So that you could take advantage of this idea that, oh, these cards have more color pips. Let's do something that gives you some kind of value based on that.
I think Chroma just wasn't quite working. I think it wasn't expandable. I don't know. There's all sorts of reasons it might not have worked. In Eventide. And then fast forward to Theros.
Right. So R&D gets to Theros, and they're thinking about, okay, there's gods. This is Greek mythology. How do we represent what makes these gods powerful? And what they happen upon is, okay, well, devotion, right? Being devoted to your god makes things powerful. So how do we represent that in a mechanical way? We do that through showing the number of color pips on a card or how devoted you are to a particular color. In the original Theros set, we have gods that are one color, right? We have like Heliod and the other ones.
Purphoros.
Purphoros,
That's one.
What's the black one? Erboros.
Sure.
Erebos. Right?
Erboros. I think that's his name.
Erboros. Sure. So we have these other gods that are all single colors. And so we look at, okay, these are how do we represent the devotion to them? It's that you are running only that color or the majority of that color in your deck. So the more you have of that color, the more devoted you are to that color. And that's the sort of reflavor on Chroma that I think really clicks in the mechanic in with flavor to make it feel really interesting.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that they did as well, shifting away from Chroma, was that Chroma was sort of like anything involving color pips. So it was color pips of cards in your graveyard, or it could have been color pips of cards on the field or in your hand or whatever. And Devotion, it was very inconsistent. And so Devotion just said, to hell with it. It's only stuff on the field. Right. And that's it. And I think that allowed them to do a lot simpler text. It allowed them to just get straight to the flavorful word of devotion and say, if your devotion is 7 or less or whatever, then this doesn't happen.
Right. And it also let them move this from an ability word to a keyword, right? Because now all of it now works the same. You can say your devotion to, rather than having to sort of explain the color pips and the way the Chroma does every time.
Right. And so I think now, because of that, because they were able to end up simplifying it, I think on top of that, knowing it was consistent, they could build upon that system, right? I should have grabbed examples of cards that built upon it.
Thassa's Oracle. Wah, wah.
Sure. I mean, is that a good example? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at like... basically, devotion ends up referencing like sort of just the number. So it makes it so you have a lot of different things that you can do with that number now, right? As you're looking at the number of devotion you have in play, that sort of simplifies to that specific number instead of you having to sort of explain how you come up with a number every time, right?
Yeah.
So then you can do things like, all right, well, you have Gray Merchant of Asphodel, who I think it's Asphodel. Is that how you say it? Gary. You have Gary.
Illustrated by Robbie Trevino.
Oh, really?
Shout out to Robbie Trevino.
Oh, did he did the newer one? He must have done the reprint one.
Maybe
Anyway, I'll show it on screen. So,
yeah.
But yeah, you can have something as simple as Gray Merchant, where, he comes into play. Opponent loses life, you gain life equal to your devotion to black. And then you can do something as complicated as like Thassa's Oracle, right? Where you're like, okay, well, now we're looking at the number of cards you have left in your library. And if that's equal or, less than or equal to the number of devotion you have to blue, then you win the game.
Right.
So it gives a lot of design space to be able to be utilized now, because you don't have to explain how to come up with that number every time.
Right.
Cool. So the other thing that it adds, when we go from Chroma to Devotion. Chroma, like we mentioned, there's only like 10 cards. There wasn't that many cards that utilize this mechanic. The as fan, as we hear Mark Rosewater mention all the time, as fan meaning if you fanned out a booster pack, it's the how often the thing would appear in a booster pack. Do you know that's what that is?
Okay. Is it like an abbreviation of something, or what?
No.
It's just as fan?
It's just as fan. Like
as a fan.
As a fan.
That's the stupid... Jesus.
Yeah,
okay.
I know.
Okay, look. I love you, Marky. All right? Marky boy. I'm for you. Okay.
We're on your side.
We need a term. Okay, as fan is not... In the same thing that you did with Chroma to Devotion.
There you go.
We need that for as fan. All right? What's the new as fan term? That you go, oh, that's like flying.
Right.
It's like I'm flying over you. We need that.
What if it was frequency? It's just the frequency at which a card shows up in a booster pack.
Nah, that's too...
No?
Nah, it's not flavorful enough,
right.
Yeah.
Any rate, so, Jesus Christ. So the as fan of Chroma was too low for you to really have a particular build around strategy to it. So
it couldn't be integrated into the set
as
a primary mechanic.
And there's a lot of consequences of that, right? It's in a smaller set. It's a kind of a niche mechanic. It's not keyworded. There's sort of all of these things stacked against it. So that doesn't really... there was no Chroma deck, right? There was a deck that used Chroma, maybe one of the cards, but that was pretty much it.
Yeah. This time around, though, I think them early on deciding that this is going to be a major point in the set, and them having the idea of this whole Greek god thing. I feel like this may have just been that they stumbled into success with this type of a mechanic, because I think if it weren't for the fact that it's building up to Greek gods, that it might not have seen the success that it saw. But the fact that it's so flavorful, without the Greek gods, it works still, right? The devotion to a particular color, I think, still works really well. But the fact that it was a set that introduced these giant gods that you could unlock once your devotion was high enough, I think was so cool and so flavorful that it made it much more memorable.
Yes. Yeah, and I think this is a really good example of how flavor can really solidify a mechanic in people's memory.
Right.
and sort of give it an interesting context that makes it cool, right?
It's kind of like, imagine Phyrexian mana if they didn't have Phyrexians, right? If it was just like evil mana,
Right.
bad mana, and you go, oh yeah, that bad mana mechanic
Oh,
they did,
man.
that was weird.
Bad mana. Oof. Corrupt mana.
Yeah.
Bummer.
It's like maybe that would have done something, but no, it's like Phyrexian mana, and you're
Yeah.
seeing Phyrexians all over, and you're like, wow, yeah.
That is an interesting trade-off with making something that can be evergreen, right?
Yeah.
Like and Devotion does such a great job of sort of both of these things, right? Where in the context of Theros and gods, it makes perfect sense, but you could just have it as sort of a devotion thing outside of
Right.
Theros. Like this could be an evergreen mechanic that works well on cultists or knights or
Yeah.
whatever, these things that are devoted to a cause of some
You have,
sort.
if you have any
Yeah.
monocolor block, what's like, or no, they don't do blocks, sorry, monocolor set, right? A theme. Like if you do any sort of monocolor theme for a set now, like you can essentially utilize devotion in that way, right? Because
Yeah.
it's going to be clear in the narrative,
Right.
like, okay, there's a through line for this color.
Right.
So your devotion to that, you get something great. Second reason is that it made monocolor actually matter for once, as opposed to previously where it was trying to utilize this hybrid color. And a lot of the times in past sets, there's almost always a benefit that's clear if you're trying to do multicolor in any sort of a way, right? So instead of your 2/2 grizzly bear that you get for your 2 mana or whatever, if you end up having a green mana and a red mana, then suddenly it might be a 3/2 bear or something.
Right.
Like you get a benefit for taking the risk of having to potentially restrict your mana.
Right, yeah.
And in this, it gave this opportunity to say, well, if you want to only devote yourself to this one color, you will get a benefit. So you are locking yourself out of the color pie and the other possibilities of that color pie and restricting yourself, but you could potentially have these other benefits from it.
I think the other thing that's really important about how it makes sort of monocolor matter more is it recontextualized so many cards that already existed in Magic. And I think being able to pull this off with a newer mechanic is pretty rare.
Yeah.
In that now, if you go back and look at your collection of cards, you're looking for any card that's got a ton of color pips, and you're going,
Right.
"Wow, this like matters now." Where it's a part of the card that didn't really matter before.
Right. Off the top of my head, I can't think I know there are mechanics that have done this, but it's so rare that they end up coming out that, yeah, it's always exciting when it happens.
And so the last thing of the top 3 reasons why Landfall, why Devotion's great, is that it is similar to Landfall in that it is rewarding you for something that you sort of already want to do. You know, there are cool cards that cost a lot of colored pips that are, and playing a monocolored deck is an interesting change up in the sort of normal course of play, especially in constructed Magic, where 2 and 3 colors is often the most common, unless you're playing a really linear aggressive strategy like mono red or mono white. But now we're seeing devoting myself to one particular color is giving me dividends, and I don't really have to do anything outside of just do that.
It adding this sort of secondary resource. I mean, essentially, we talk about it all the time. Every mechanic is just kicker or cycling. We have a whole video on it, even. And this is just another form of kicker, basically, where you can play the card, but if you invest a little bit more time or resources into the future, then it can potentially become stronger in some way. But what's really, really cool is that it created a secondary resource without adding any additional cruft.
Right.
There's no counters. There's no tokens. There's no, the ring tempts you. You got to have this card about how the ring tempts you so that you know what it does. You don't need any of that.
Devotion being a great example of a way to reuse the assets that you already have. Right. These are already on the card. How do we recontextualize them rather than how do we add an extra counter like something like energy or something does?
Right.
Where now you have to track this additional, you need these new game pieces, you have to like track this additional resource in a way where here it's like, well, I'm going to count it up when it matters, and when it doesn't, it fades to the background.
Yeah. And I just love that, like, I mean, you're seeing a lot of games start to kind of do this. But Altered, I think, is kind of a recent game that does this, where it's like it's adding this like almost just a whole third number to go off of, right? To recontextualize.
Lorcana too.
Lorcana, yeah, that's right. Yeah, they do like lore or something. Is what it's called.
You've got like essentially power, toughness, and then also lore,
Right.
which is how much you're character like quests for.
Right. And so now I just think it's so cool. Now you have all of these cards that, you mentioned earlier that are just recontextualized that you can read through and you recognize like, okay, it has this power, this toughness, but is offering this much devotion. And that might come in handy depending on, what type of a deck you're building.
Yeah. So what are the takeaways for game designers here?
Flavor.
Yeah. Flavor matters.
Flavor.
Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Way more than I think most, I don't know, players, designers even, maybe give it credit for.
Yeah.
That flavor can change your perception of something drastically. It can make a mechanic that you felt was unfair suddenly seem fair, right? If suddenly now it's just recontextualized with a different term and you go, oh yeah, okay, well that makes sense. The mechanic's called shit out of luck. And now that I know it's called that, now I'm like, I am shit out of luck.
Damn it. I lose.
It got me.
Yeah. But if it was called you win.
Right. What the
hell? Not gonna make any sense.
I didn't win.
Yeah, I think on top of the flavor being so important here, I think the other thing that this shows us is how important making something consistent is, right?
Yeah.
Like Chroma being calculating the number in a bunch of different kinds of ways and then also using it in other ways. It's like you almost want half of that to be consistent.
It's
right?
like consistent but expandable, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like you can tell someone what that effect does, but if it's scalable, then it means that you only have to explain it once and someone can then follow that scale, right? And I think that it's great.
And then last, I think you should be looking for ways that you can use parts of your assets that you haven't utilized before.
Yeah.
And this is one that's like, well, you're not always going to be able to like find gold in that way.
I doubt Richie G back in the day was like, someday these color pips, they're going to be counted as a second resource. Like I highly doubt that was something they probably considered. And so I feel like some card games artificially create this. Like the Digimon card game, for instance, has like 3 subtypes for creatures. Yeah. Like you end up having the name and then underneath it, it's like, it's a vaccine angel demon. And you're like, what? Okay. All right. Doesn't come into play at all in any card effects, as far as I know, until several sets later when finally they reference vaccine cards. But it's like, it feels weird to like be like, we don't know how this is going to happen, but it's sort of like setting yourself up for eventual potential design space. Yeah,
I don't think it's a bad idea other than making sure that you're not making things too complicated, like too busy, right? In terms of like the design of the card, there shouldn't be too much stuff on the card. Otherwise you look at it and you're just like, it just looks like a wall of text, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of games have that problem. Okay, cool. Well, that's devotion. And I think the last question that remains is, why is this not evergreen?
Why is it not evergreen, Mark?
Let's see more devotion.